cold coffee sat forgotten under flickering fluorescent lights the morning Grace Whitmore was quietly told she didn't belong. Apron-folded challenge coin tucked in her pocket. At 42, working Betty's Diner in Oak Hollow, Arkansas, Grace's calm hid a story no one guessed. What happens when the quietest person holds the loudest secrets? Share if you've ever been misjudged by a single glance. Every morning before sunrise, Grace Whitmore unlocked the side door of Betty's Diner like she'd done it forever. No fuss, no sound, just purpose. The door creaked soft, like it knew her rhythm. Inside, the scent of yesterday's syrup and old vinyl seats lingered in the air. Grace flicked the light switch with 2 fingers, same ones she used to line up coffee mugs with clockwork symmetry. She moved through the space with quiet familiarity, flipping chairs down from tabletops, setting silverware with precision. Each napkin fold held the kind of square edge that made paper feel starched. As she wiped the condensation from the diner's front window, her eyes paused just briefly on a fading flyer for last year's Veterans Day brunch. The paper had yellowed, the tape curled at the corners, but the stars and stripes still clung proudly to the grainy image of a folded flag and smiling servicemen. Outside, the sky barely lit up. A few street lamps buzzed. Oak Hollow woke up slowly, and Grace moved even slower. Inside, the radio buzzed to life, Patsy Cline crooning Crazy through static. The coffee pot hissed its first breath. She poured in the grounds, waited for that first plunk. Betty June came in 10 minutes later wearing a mustard-yellow sweater and a red bandana that had seen better election years. "Mornin', sweet pea," she called as she untied her scarf and looped it over the coat hook. Grace nodded, already stacking toast into the warmer. Eddie Larkins strolled in like he always did before the second pot brewed. Vietnam ball cap on paperback mystery in one hand, folded $5 bill in the other. "You see the price of pecans this week?" he asked Betty, settling into his stool at the far end of the counter. "Outrageous!" Betty leaned on the counter, one elbow on the linoleum. "You want pie, you gotta pay for the nuts. That's economics, Eddie." Grace slid a mug in front of him, filled it without asking. He smiled and gave a quiet thanks. She simply gave a nod and turned back to wiping the same section of counter she'd just cleaned. The door flung open harder than necessary. Boots clomped in loud voices riding on the morning air. 4 young men in desert camo sauntered through like they owned the booth seats. The one in front, Kyle, had his sunglasses hooked on the back of his collar, and that restless bounce in his walk that said he wasn't used to quiet places. "Man, this place smells like 1962, one joked. Kyle scanned the room, then locked on Grace. "You ever think some folks hide behind aprons instead of uniforms?" he said loud enough for everyone to hear. Betty's spatula hit the grill a little harder than needed. Eddie looked up from his book but didn't say a word. Grace didn't flinch. She faced Kyle with all the expression of a blank page. "Cream or sugar?" she asked, voice smooth as black coffee. Neither, he muttered, taken aback, settling into a booth with a half shrug. Betty poured batter onto the griddle, flipping pancakes with practiced indifference. "Refills are on the house for gentlemen." "And gentlemen in progress," she called out. The diner chuckled softly. Kyle let out a short laugh like he didn't get the joke, or maybe just didn't want to. Grace returned to her task, pouring more coffee, wiping another section of counter, even though it shone clean as church glass. Eddie sipped his cup, eyes trained not on the boys, but on Grace's hands. He watched her movements, the way her back stayed straight, how her footfalls never echoed, just landed quietly with purpose. Her right hand, which had been steady all morning, gave the briefest tremble as she picked up the next pot. Kyle said something under his breath and stood. He clicked his heels together and raised 2 fingers to his brow in a mock salute. "Thanks for your service, waitress." Grace paused mid-step. "1 second. maybe less. Then she kept walking. The coffee pot didn't spill. Her shoulders never twitched. But her right hand, Eddie saw it tightened just enough to turn knuckles white before she set the pot down. Outside, wind picks up. A single brown leaf sticks to the diner window like a shadowed badge. Grace looks at it a moment longer than needed, then turns away. Grace lifted 3 plates at once and slid them onto the counter, with a grace that made Betty mutter "Earl." Moves like she's carried gear heavier than pie trays. The diner smelled like grilled cheese and warm cinnamon from the pie cooling on the sill. Outside, the afternoon wore a coat of drizzle, and rain tapped lightly on the windows, like it was asking to come in. Inside, spoons clinked against thick mugs, and someone had dropped a quarter in the old jukebox Merle Haggard hummed about, fighting through Sunday morning. Grace moved between booths without breaking stride. She straightened a fork that was half a centimeter off and tucked a napkin edge under a chipped plate with fingers too sure to be accidental. Eddie noticed. So did Betty. Betty, drying her hands on a rag, paused in front of a picture frame near the register. She wiped the glass gently with her thumb. Inside, the photograph showed her late husband in uniform, standing proud beside a rust-colored Jeep, with one hand on the shoulder of a younger recruit. Grace glanced over her eyes, pausing on the image, her breath hitching just slightly, before she turned back to the grill. "I keep it there," Betty said, not looking up so he doesn't miss a shift. Grace gave a faint smile but said nothing. By 3 o'clock, the soldiers had returned. Kyle slouched into the corner booth with his boots half-laced, his voice louder than needed. He drummed his fingers on the table, glanced at Grace, and gave a sharp whistle. "Think she's ever smiled?" one of them muttered. "Marches like she's still in basic," Kyle said, then got up and exaggerated her walk. Tight shoulders, straight spine, arms pinned in line. The others laughed. From the counter, Eddie didn't look up from his paperback. "Some women you don't mock, son," he said mildly. "They've walked where you haven't." Kyle's grin faltered. He scratched at his cheek, sat back down. Grace, unmoved, delivered a slice of pie to Mr. Harlan, who had wandered in somewhere between the teasing and the silence. He was built like an old fence post, lean, stiff, dependable, and always wore his mailman cap, though he hadn't delivered letters in over 5 years. He nodded to her once, slow and deliberate. She gave him a small nod back, then turned to wipe down a booth. A salt shaker tumbled off the edge of a table behind her, and before anyone could react, she caught it mid-air without turning her head. She returned it upright to the table and moved on like nothing happened. From behind the counter, Betty said, "Girl's got reflexes like a house cat." She once lifted Mrs. Lilly right off the sidewalk, Betty added, to no one in particular. "Dead weight, too. That was last winter. Didn't even grunt." The rain tapped louder. Kyle stirred sugar into his coffee, suddenly quiet. Grace passed behind him, and he didn't meet her eyes. Later, as the crowd thinned and the diner took on its evening hush, Mr. Harlan slipped his check and a stack of dollar bills under the edge of his plate. Grace came to clear it and found a napkin folded beside the bills. On it, in blocky handwriting, was a single line to the ones who don't speak of what they've done. She folded the napkin once, then again, slipping it into her apron pocket. The sky outside deepened to slate. The neon sign flickered a little with each gust of wind. Grace stepped out the side door, letting the rain touch her bare arms. Across the street, the flag in the square flapped, soaked but upright. She watched it a moment, unmoving. Then her lips pressed into a thin line, and her back straightened as though someone had called her name. That night, in her small apartment above the diner, she opens a box. Inside, a folded uniform patch and a silver challenge coin. The first rumble was distant like far-off thunder, but steadier, coming closer. Betty looked up from the counter, one eyebrow raised. A coffee mug shook faintly in her hand. The windows of Betty's diner gave a low hum, as if acknowledging the vibration before anyone else did. Earlier that morning, while locking up, Grace had said in that even tone of hers, "Sometimes the past finds its way back, no matter how quiet you live." Betty had chuckled, then thinking it one of those cryptic phrases Grace sometimes dropped like loose nickels. But now, with that steady tremble rolling through the diner's floor tiles, she wasn't so sure it was just talk. Outside, a silver fog clung to Oak Hollow, like a breath held too long. Flags posted along the square flapped half-heartedly in the breeze, catching damp mist instead of wind. Inside the diner buzzed with the clatter of forks and weekend chatter. Veterans Day decorations dangled from the ceiling. Paper stars, red, white, blue streamers, and a handmade sign over the register read, "Thank you for your service." Kyle and his group were back louder than usual. One of them snorted. "Bet she polished the counter with a salute today." Another added, "What she got tucked in that apron, dog tags or peppermints?" Grace didn't respond. She delivered a tray of waffles and hash browns, her movements crisp, silent. She moved like the fog itself, always there, never in the way. Eddie sat at his usual stool, eyes narrowed toward the window. The sound was growing a low roar, steady and mechanical. Then it came one Humvee, then another, and another. They rolled past the town library and curved into the square like a well-timed parade. Dozens in neat formation, engines pulsing like the chest of something alive and deliberate. The diner fell still. Betty stepped forward, wiping her hands on her apron, though they were already dry. "Well, I'll be." Dust rose outside as the tires gripped the wet pavement. Humvees parked in perfect alignment along Main Street. Soldiers exited each vehicle with practiced ease, boots landing in unison. Their uniforms were crisp, their faces steady, but their eyes were searching. Then came her Colonel Joe McCready. Mid-50s stride like granite hair swept tight beneath her cap. She didn't pause. She didn't check her path. She marched directly toward the diner door. The bell chimed as she entered. The air shifted. Conversations froze mid-sentence. Even the jukebox gave out one last note before falling silent. McCready's gaze scanned the room, once sharp and swift, then landed on Grace. "Sergeant Major Whitmore," she said, voice echoing through the hush. "Reporting in, ma'am. We found you." Kyle's mouth opened, but no sound followed. His fork slipped from his fingers, clinking softly against his plate. Across the counter, Eddie's lips curved into something that was almost a smirk. Betty reached for her apron, dabbing at her eyes in a way she hoped looked like she was cleaning her glasses. She wasn't. From the street outside, more movement stirred. Grace turned, slowly walked past the counter and stepped to the doorway. McCready stepped back, clearing the path. Outside, lined from curb to curb, the soldiers from Grace's old unit stood still. And then, like a tide shifting direction, they raised their hands and saluted sharp, synchronized, solemn. McCready held hers a moment longer before lowering it. "We came to bring her back," she said clearly, her voice carrying into every corner of the diner. "If she's willing." Grace didn't speak right away. She looked at Betty, then at Eddie, then back out to the fog and the rows of still waiting soldiers. Her jaw moved slightly, and then she gave a small nod. "Let me finish the breakfast shift first." No one in the diner moved, not even the syrup. The past had just walked in wearing polished boots and full honors. Silence had settled so thick it made the ticking of the wall clock sound theatrical. Plates steamed, untouched mugs of coffee went cold by the minute. Every eye in Betty's diner traced the solemn line of soldiers as they stood in the morning light like quiet statues casting long shadows through the window. Eddie cleared his throat once but said nothing. The night before, he had told Betty while drying spoons and watching the rain, "If she's who I think she is, We've been sitting on a national secret all year." Now he sat motionless as if afraid even a blink might cause the moment to vanish. Colonel Macready remained by the door, boots still damp from dew hands behind her back in rest position. Her face was unreadable save for the way her eyes softened whenever they landed on Grace. Grace herself stood behind the counter. The woman who once moved like vapor now seemed oddly rooted. Not frozen, just braced. She adjusted the sleeve of her apron, as if it were a cuffed uniform, and looked straight ahead. A low murmur rippled through the diner as more townsfolk filtered in from outside. Not tourists, not press. Neighbors, veterans, people who had seen Grace refill their mugs without fuss for a year, and never once thought to ask why her eyes always checked the exits first. Macready took a step forward. Her voice was quiet, but the weight behind it silenced even the sizzle from the kitchen. She led a convoy through a mountain pass under shell fire, carried 2 wounded by herself, refused to be airlifted until every name on her list had a heartbeat. A man in uniform stepped out from the crowd, older than the rest, silver along his temples. He pulled something from his jacket pocket and placed it gently on the counter, a small photograph, edges curled with time. It showed a younger Grace, dirt-streaked and resolute, crouched beside a wounded soldier, one arm across his chest, the other gripping a radio mic. Eddie leaned forward to get a closer look. His bottom lip trembled. "Different war," he whispered, "same courage." Betty walked around the counter without a word and placed a slice of pecan pie in front of Macready. She didn't say it was on the house. She didn't have to. From the far booth, Kyle stood up stiff as if unsure what to do with his hands. He approached the counter slowly, eyes darting once toward Grace, then to the photograph. He reached into the breast pocket of his denim jacket and took out a small, tarnished USMC pin. Without speaking, he placed it carefully in front of her, then stepped back. Grace blinked once. Her shoulders lowered just slightly. Macready turned again to face the diner. "You all know her as Grace Whitmore," she said. "To us, she was Sergeant Major Whitmore. Quiet, precise. And the reason more than a few of us are standing here today." A hush followed, long and still. Then Grace spoke, her voice steady, but softer than most had ever heard it. "I didn't serve for medals," she said. "I served because good people needed someone to stand next to them." The silence that followed felt different, like reverence instead of surprise. Later that afternoon, long after the last Humvee had pulled away, and the bells on the diner door had rung themselves hoarse, a plain envelope arrived. No stamp, just folded carefully and slipped beneath the door. Grace found it while sweeping. She opened it slowly, her brow furrowing as her eyes scanned the words. "You saved my dad. He never talked about it, but I found your name in his field notes. Thank you. Macready, we came to bring you back. Not to fight, to teach. The Corps could use a quiet voice like yours." Grace stood in the back room of the diner, holding the old patch from her uniform like it still held weight. The room around her buzzed faintly with kitchen clatter, Betty humming off-key to a classic Roy Orbison song, cinnamon rolls cooling near the back window. Outside, the town square stirred. You could hear the brass section of the school band tuning up bursts of off notes, followed by laughter and gentle reprimands. Earlier in the week, Betty had teased her while stacking jam packets. Grace had smirked and said, "The only battlefield I want now is between buttered toast and jam." Betty had chuckled, then not knowing a real choice was coming. Now Grace traced the patch between her fingers. The embroidery thread was slightly frayed, but the stitching still held firm. She slid it into her pocket as Macready walked in her boots, softer this time, like even they knew to tread gently. "I won't stay long," Macready said, eyes scanning the worn tiles. You've got your rhythm here. Grace nodded once. We're starting a training program. Nothing flashy. Ethics, leadership, preparation. No deployments. Just building the next generation right. McCready paused. We'd like you to lead a portion of it, if you're willing. Grace said nothing, only stirred her coffee, watching the swirl of cream settle. The silence stretched. Later that afternoon, she stepped out of the diner and walked slowly through Oak Hollow. The sidewalks had chalk drawings from the school kids, stick figure soldiers, American flags, hearts. Storefronts draped in crepe paper, stars in the windows, one with a sign. Thank you, Sergeant M. Near the center of the square, beneath a cluster of fluttering flags, lay a wreath with a small white card. Her name was written in tight, neat script. She hadn't told anyone she was ever in the service. She knelt slowly and touched the ribbon. There was no signature. Betty found her a few minutes later holding a small leather notebook. My husband wrote in this during Korea. Some of it's nonsense about rations and socks. Some of it's about the men he served with. Figured maybe you could add a chapter or two of your own. Grace took it with both hands, the way you accept something fragile. Her thumb ran along the embossed initials, JRJ. He wrote like a commander, Betty added, but he dreamed like a cook. Back at the diner, Kyle lingered near the pie case, awkward in his stance, no longer cocky. I started working on an application, he said. Officer candidate school. Don't laugh. I know I got a lot to learn, but would you maybe look over my letter? You know, just for clarity. Grace smiled just slightly, taking the folded page from his hand. She read without speaking, nodding once when finished. Start with why. Not what she said quietly. Eddie overheard the exchange and winked at her. Told you he had something in him besides ego. The sun dipped low. Brass instruments now played in rhythm, and townsfolk moved toward the square for the Veterans Day bell ceremony. Grace walked down Main Street alone until she reached the old barber shop. The payphone still worked barely. She fed in the coins and waited for the click. Joe, she said when McCready answered. Tell them I'll come. Not forever, but I'll help them find their footing. Across the street, Eddie leaned against a post, sipping his coffee, watching her with that same half-smile he'd worn since he first guessed who she was. Betty waved from the diner's doorway, mouthing, You keeping the upstairs? Grace gave a small nod. As the town prepared for the Veterans Day bell to ring, Grace pins her challenge coin inside her apron pocket. 6 months later, Grace returned to the diner like sunrise, quiet, steady, and right on time. The spring morning had a hush to it, the kind that made tulips in the window boxes seem almost self-aware in their bright reds and yellows. The door creaked open just enough, and Grace slipped in with her apron folded neatly under one arm. Betty glanced up from wiping the counter, then went right back to it, lips curled in the faintest smile. The echo of an old phrase from Betty came to mind. This place is a lighthouse. People don't always need saving, but they need to know where safe is. Eddie sat in his usual spot, a cane leaning against his booth. He looked older, maybe by a few months, maybe more, but his coffee cup was already half empty. Well, he muttered without looking up. You can take the soldier out of uniform, but the diner'll always draft you again. Grace chuckled under her breath, tied her apron, and stepped behind the counter like she'd never left. Her hands moved automatically, coffee poured, filter-swapped mugs turned upright like dominoes. The space had been updated slightly, new paint on the walls, brighter lights, a newer toaster. But her stretch of counter untouched, as if the place had been holding its breath. Betty passed her a plate of biscuits. Welcome home, Whitmore. Later that morning, the bell rang once sharp. Kyle stepped in, clean-cut and tall in a plain gray training hoodie. His boots looked barely worn, but his eyes had a depth they didn't carry last fall. "Got a minute?" he asked, holding out a small package. Inside was a military field manual, well-thumbed initials GW etched into the inside cover. "Don't ask how I got it engraved. Let's just say Officer Candidate School teaches more than formations." Grace took it gently, eyes flickering across the ink. "Good luck," she said. "I won't need luck," Kyle replied, tapping the cover. "I had good instructors." They shared a quiet nod before he headed out again, pausing just long enough to wave at Betty, who waved back with a dish rag. Near the corner of the diner, a new face had taken a seat. A young woman in fatigues, no name tag cap pulled low. She hadn't ordered anything, just sat watching the steam rise from her water glass. Grace noticed. Without asking, she brought over a slice of pie and a cup of coffee, setting them down without a word. The girl looked up. "They said I'd find someone here who could tell me how to lead quietly." Grace pulled out the stool across from her and sat, elbows resting gently on the counter. "I don't talk much," she said, "but I'll listen as long as you need." Outside, the breeze stirred the flags in the square. The faded Veterans Day banner still hung above the window, its colors now soft and dusty like an old memory that refused to leave. Eddie tapped his cane twice on the floor, nodded toward Grace. "Lighthouse," he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. At some point, Betty wandered over to the front window and, with the same quiet care she used for rolling pie crust, placed a tiny brass star beneath the sill. No name, no frame, just a glint of honor in morning light. Grace never noticed, or if she did, she didn't say. Then, just as the coffee finished brewing and someone asked for more sugar, the bell on the diner door rang again. More boots walked in. "Grace says coffee's hot. Take your time." In the quiet moments after the last visitor has left Betty's diner, there lingers a gentle truth. Sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones told without words. Grace's journey reminds us that kindness given without expectation weaves itself quietly into the fabric of our lives, changing hearts and opening doors unseen. Just as a lighthouse doesn't demand attention, but simply shines its light, a simple act of goodness can guide us through life's darkest nights. When we set aside our judgments, we find the doorway to real compassion waiting to be opened. Perhaps today, a smile, a nod, or a helping hand could be the quiet gift that someone near you needs. If this story has touched your heart, consider passing that warmth along. It might just light the way for someone else.